Visitors to Asciano, a small Tuscan town, are attracted by the local Museum of Archaeology and Sacred Art. Once you walk into the first rooms of Palazzo Corboli, in search of medieval artists and Etruscan urns, you will be surprised and enchanted by the wall frescoes in an evocative hall, called the Aristotle Room. These frescoes are the work of Cristoforo di Bindoccio and Meo de Pero, two Sienese painters, workshop colleagues active in the second half of the 14th century. The room probably served as a place of representation for the rich Sienese Bandinelli family. It also became the council meeting place for the village, where justice was administered. As with the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena, the frescoes that decorated its walls were intended to orient the citizenry. The iconography, centered on the figures of Aristotle and Bàrlaam, has a precise message to convey to visitors: a declaration of public ethics. Of the frescoed wheels in the room, the one that most attracts the visitor's interest is also the best preserved, on the northeast wall. It is composed, in turn, of 9 wheels. A larger one in the center, and 8 surrounding it in the guise of a crown, each decorated with a story and accompanied by a descriptive inscription. In the center we find a very rare figuration taken from the legend of Barlaam, a Christian reinterpretation of a Buddhist myth, which found a fortunate diffusion in medieval Europe. Through the well-known parable of Barlaam, the central medallion narrates an apologue on the vanity of worldly things. The absolute protagonist is the Indian prince Josaphat, who grew up amid worldly pleasures in his father's palace. Kept away from the evils of the world, he ended up getting to know them, encountering one day a blind man, a leper, an old man, and a corpse. He realized that the world was quite different from how he had known it, and that existence could also be full of pain. Josaphat had the good fortune to meet a Christian hermit, Barlaam. Through the wise man's teachings, the young man decided to convert and abandon worldly things, to devote himself to an ascetic life of meditation. This story was widely spread throughout Europe, also narrated in the Golden Legend. How this legend could have come to Asciano is quickly said. In the mystical Siena of St. Catherine's time, the story of Barlaam and Josaphat was a great success. St. Catherine's secretary himself, the man of letters Neri de Landocchio Palaresi, composed a poem in verse. The legend became the subject of various figurative works. It is already found in the 13th century, in one of the lunettes of the baptistry of Parma. In a fresco in the Cistercian Abbey of the Three Fountains in Rome, dated between the 13th and 14th centuries. Also in a 14th century relief in Ferrara Cathedral. In comparison, this is one of the most complex, as it contains several scenes that support the thesis of the fresco. The central wheel is also known as the unicorn apology. In fact, the tale tells of a man who, being chased by a wild unicorn, risked falling into a precipice if he had not clung to a tree. The danger of the unicorn seems averted. But there are two rats, one white and one black, gnawing at the base of the tree. Finally, at the bottom of the ravine, there is a menacing ravenous dragon that seems to be waiting for the unfortunate man. However, the man finds a honeycomb on one of the branches of the tree, and decides to stop worrying about the unicorn, the mice, the snakes and the dragon. The interesting aspect of the wheel is that every single detail is described and interpreted. Words and figures become inseparable. The power of the former is transferred to the latter. Thus, next to the mice, we find two explanatory inscriptions. On either side of the tree, to indicate the man, is a caption. The entire scene is accompanied by an epigraph, which sounds like an inexorable sentence. It is the same story of Barlaam that adds the meaning of the symbols and the moral. Here the unicorn represents death, which is always chasing man and trying to catch him. The tree is the life of each of us, consumed by the hours of day and night, the white mouse and the black mouse. Thus, he approaches the moment when he will inevitably be shot down. The terrible dragon is the mouth of hell, which wants to swallow everyone. The mellifluous sweetness that descends from the twigs is the deceptive pleasure of the world, by which man is deceived, and heeds no danger. Continuing the reading of the fresco, the 8 wheels accompanying the one with the parable of the unicorn develop as many stories referring to inglorious deaths of kings and powerful men of antiquity. As if to emphasize that perdition does not spare even those who have reached the highest ranks of power. The first tondo at the top shows the end of the Roman Emperor Nero. Officially deposed by the Senate, Nero fled from his domus, where he was left alone, unprotected, and committed suicide, with a dagger to his throat. Before he died, he uttered the phrase, "What an artist dies in me." Clockwise, the tondo with the death of Pompey, Caesar's great opponent, follows. Pompey, defeated, seeks protection in Egypt. But Ptolemy, in order to ingratiate himself with Caesar, arranges his execution on the boat he was in. The fresco shows him on his knees, hands folded, as the executor's sword decapitates him. The inscription framing the third round identifies Priam, king of Troy, and father of Hector. We see him, as he is about to be killed by the sword of Pyrrhus, nickname of Neoptolemus, son of Achilles. In vain, Antenor and Aeneas rush in to try to save him. This is followed by the bloody scene of the death of Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, the consul who had destroyed Carthage and Numantia. At home he found death, at the hands of 2 assassins. As the inscription reads, the next tondo refers to the beheading of the great Cyrus, king of Persia. Tomyris, on the throne, orders the execution of Cyrus, portrayed praying on his knees and with a crown on his head. The inscription reminds us that Absalom is the 3rd son of David. Good-looking, resourceful and ambitious, he instigated an armed rebellion against his father, but was defeated in battle. Fleeing on horseback, he got his hair caught in the branches of a tree, and was overtaken by David's general. The 7th scene sees Agamemnon rising in the morning from his bed, to be immobilized in the cloth that his unfaithful wife Clytemnestra, resentful over the death of her daughter Iphigenia, has prepared for him. Cousin Aegisthus bursts into the scene, and stabs the king of Mycenae. The last tondo is dedicated to Phalaris, tyrant of Sicily and cruel autocrat of Agrigento. In the last tondo, the inscription recalls the famous bull of Phalaris, the infernal instrument of torture molded in bronze by Perilius, and used as an instrument of torture and death on the author himself. The frescoed scene depicts the stoning of the tyrant. The adjoining wall, besides the jambs decorated with the Sienese symbol and coats of arms, has 3 wheels. The first represents Nebuchadnezzar's dream. The Babylonian king had dreamt of an enormous statue, had seen it rise, and then fall, knocked down by a stone. The dream, narrated in the book of the prophet Daniel, alluded to the fall of his kingdom and the coming of gods. The central wheel is dominated by the figure of Aristotle, after whom the entire room is named. A model of virtue and personification of wisdom, the philosopher is distinguished by a flowing beard. Indicates a scroll bearing the inscription. Of the virtues depicted in the four corners, only two remain visible. Bottom left is fortitude, with a helmet on his head, a shield on his arm, and in imitation of Hercules a lion skin on his shoulder. The other female figure interprets the virtue of temperance. It is the classic medieval image of the prosopopoeia, intent on pouring water into the jug of wine, to dilute its ardor and potential exciting effects, as the inscription on the side reminds us. The other figures, even if anonymous, still had to submit to the following ruling. Remarkably, the Aristotle fresco anticipates by about 40 years that of a similar subject, painted by Taddeo da Bartolo. Despite the obvious compositional and iconographic differences, it seems to echo the same intent, that of celebrating the virtues and the philosopher, their synecdoche. One can assume a temporal continuum of an authoritative 14th century tradition, echoed in this room, and updated in Siena, where it is aligned with the new historical and cultural sensibility. Finally, in the last wheel, we find the Judgment of Solomon. This is the famous biblical episode in which the wise king, in order to settle a dispute between two mothers, ordered a child to be cut in two halves with a sword. The style of the two artists can be appreciated in the details, such as the refined taste and meticulous manner in which the clothes and hairstyles are rendered. The elongated figures in the Gothic style, an aspect combined with the freshness and liveliness of the scenes, would suggest their temporal location close to the Santa Maria della Scala cycle. A date that also appears to be entirely compatible with the acquisition by the inhabitants of the village of Sienese citizenship, which was granted to them by the Republic in 1369. The pictorial language of the two artists defines a vividly expressionistic formula, which is maintained throughout the cycle, with a consistency that serves an iconographic program of public utility, aimed at the entire citizenry. This is already enough to enhance the uniqueness of these frescoes, which are among the most precious of the 14th century in Europe.